My name is Frank. I'm an INTJ. I want to make a video today about the reason why INTJs are often portrayed as the villains or the bad guys in fiction. I remember when I first discovered I was an INTJ and just reading the profile and I looked on the list on the internet, who are the most fictional characters of your type? And more often than not, INTJs are the villains. And if you look at real life characters, actually, the real life ING people, they're not the villains. Actually, they tend to be overrepresented in fiction, and I've always wondered why. The INTJ people, they're the bad guys in real life. The one that springs to mind that's probably pretty accurate is the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski. And if you read a little bit about him, he does sound like an INTJ. He is brilliant. I think he has a few math theorems that he proved, but that's it. There might be a couple others, but generally the worst in history, like the Hitlers and the Mussolinis, they're not INTJs. Okay, it's just in fiction, and people are always wondering why are INTJs the bad guys in our fiction. And to me, I think it tells more about our society and our culture. But I'm going to come about it in a more indirect way. With me, I remember reading one of Carl Sagan's books. I can't remember which one. I think it was Demon Haunted World. And in it, he laments why scientists are always portrayed as the bad guys in fiction, or at the very least, insufferable, negative people. And it's true. Most times when you see a scientist in a film, he's really negative. But scientists in real life are nothing like what they're portrayed in movies. Scientists are romantics. They're dreamers. They want to change the world. And they're not the bad guys. Rarely, 9 times out of 10, they're just some dorky guy. And it kind of reminds me of George Carlin. One of his famous one of his bits he did was that saying, "Oh, it's the quiet ones you have to watch." And he's like, "Oh, say you're in a bar and some guy walks in with a book, and sits down and reads a book, and someone says, 'It's the quiet ones you have to watch.'" It makes no sense. Carlin goes on and says, "Meanwhile, a guy with a machete will walk in and start banging on the table and say, 'I want to kill the next guy who walks in here.' Who are you going to watch? You're going to watch the noisy one. You're not going to watch the quiet one." So that's what I always thought was ironic with scientists. But to me, I don't think it quite captures it, because there's an internet joke I've seen around where they say there's no such thing as a mad scientist. A mad scientist would come up with a hypothesis, get some observable data, test his hypothesis, refine it, and that's it. What they're thinking of is a mad engineer. A mad engineer would build a death ray on the moon and kill people. That's a mad engineer. So in fiction, a lot of times they're mad scientists, but they're really behaving more like engineers. And engineers tend to be INTJ types. INTPs tend to be more like scientists. They do a lot of scientific research, but they expand the realms of knowledge, but they don't always make use of those discoveries. INTJs usually do. But that doesn't really hint at it. And like in true scientific fashion, I look at it, you come up with an hypothesis, try to prove it negative, fail to prove it negative, it must be true. So can I come up with examples of good guys or protagonists that are INTJs? And I usually can't. I mean, I ask people, can you? No. And there's a few examples. But those characters, they're not quite always acting like INTJs. And in fiction, I take it with a grain of salt, because usually they're not always super accurate to personalities, because they're just made out of nothingness, and at one moment they could be this type, and another moment they could be that type. Or the character has been around for so long, like Batman. He's been around for about 100 years, and of course he's changed. And he's the first anti-hero. But if you take the example of Superman, this is a good example, is that Superman is the epitome of being a hero. And what does he do? He doesn't say, I have all this great power and speed, I'm going to end world hunger. Oh, I'm super powerful and invincible, I'm going to stop all wars. He doesn't. He sits around and waits for the bad guys to come up with a plan to change the world in their favor, and he stops it, and that's it. Then he goes back to the Daily Planet and sits around and pretends he's human and reports. Then Lex Luthor, more of like an INTJ, comes up with a plan to change the world, and Superman stops it. Superman is never proactive. He never tries to change the world himself, although he's infinitely more capable. And the reason why, he's a conservative hero. Superman maintains the status quo. So I've always asked my friends, can you think of a protagonist or a hero who wants to upset the status quo, who wants to change things for the better? And there is zero examples of that in fiction, period. Even Batman, who is one of the few INTJ characters out there in fiction, he doesn't want to change the world. He just like Superman, he waits as a billionaire playboy until the Joker or someone else commits a crime and he stops them. Then he goes back to doing whatever he's doing. Yeah, I know Bruce Wayne Industries probably has charity events and they give money to charity. But think of all the money he's wasting on Batmobiles and Batcopters and Batarangs that he could spend on instead on preventing poverty, which is the root of a lot of crime and inequality. But he doesn't do that. He'd rather run around in tights and punch people in the head. That's not INTJ. True Batman is probably the first anti-hero. So the INTJ fits that pretty well. And I've noticed too, anytime you do have a protagonist or a hero who is an INTJ, often he'll be paired up, or she'll be paired up against another INTJ. It's almost the same as INTJs as a villain are so unstoppable, only another villain just like him could hold up. Examples of this would be Sherlock Holmes and Moriarty. Although I think the argument could be made that Sherlock Holmes isn't quite an INTJ. To me, he almost seems like an ISTJ. There's examples of he only wants to know the minimum information possible, and he's not super intuitive. He's more like a machine, and he runs through the computations. And also, there's been examples in literature where he says he doesn't really care about the solar system or how many planets are in the solar system because it doesn't affect his crime-fighting abilities. It doesn't bear on his day-to-day activities, which is very much an S characteristic, a sensing characteristic. But Moriarty is definitely an INTJ through and through. A better one is probably Silence of the Lambs, Hannibal and Clarice. Clarice is definitely an INTJ, and of course, Hannibal is too. So that's one pattern I've noticed with fiction is that INTJs often are paired against each other if there is. With Batman, there's plenty of intellectual villains they pair him up against. That could be INTJs. Hugo Strange for sure, Bane perhaps. So it goes back to the real question, why are INTJs so popular in fiction? And I think it goes down to the root that it says more about our society than it does about our INTJs. Our society wants and craves a conservative hero, a person that comes by and maintains the status quo. Now, Superman, for example, when he first started, is very fascinating because it's a response to Friedrich Nietzsche's idea of the Superman or the Übermensch. And in his book, Beyond Good and Evil, he comes up with the idea, well, if we have no religion, we have no punishment, there's no good and evil. Just do whatever you want. You're not bound by limitations of society. You are free. You can strike like lightning at anywhere. You are powerful. And to the creators of Superman, they thought that was horrible. That would be a monster. So their first Superman character was a bold villain. He would just do whatever he wanted, and he was a monster. That's what became Superman. He looked like Lex Luthor. He was like an INTJ. And actually, when he started, Superman did destroy a lot of slumlords and helped fight poverty in the city. But as he became more and more popular, he conformed to the public's expectation of what a hero would be. And he maintained the status quo. So what is it about our society that we cannot have a hero that changes things for the better? And interestingly enough, if you just ignore the INTJ fact, can you come up with a hero that changes things for the better? Well, there are a few examples in our history, but typically they're nonfiction. They're not fictional characters. I might be mixing those up. I don't know. But real life characters, they are changing things. Take for example, I'm not religious, but it doesn't matter if you are or not. Take for example Jesus Christ. He was very much changing the status quo. He'd be in church and see money changers and chase them around with a whip. So much so the Romans crucified him for it. So, I mean, you change the status quo, it's going to upset people. He wasn't an INTJ, I don't think. That's a stretch. He's probably an ENFJ if you want to categorize him. I'm not a big fan of categorizing fictional characters or historical characters, but unless you talk to him, because then you're just talking off secondhand sources. But regardless, Jesus was a rabble rouser. He was a radical, and if you were his contemporary, if you were Roman, you would have thought he was a villain. You would have thought he was a bad guy, and that look what happened to him. Well, fortunately, his dad was well connected and it got him out of a tight spot. But that doesn't happen for normal people, normal mortals like us. And another example would be Martin Luther, who from the Protestant Reformation, he's considered an INTJ as well, and it makes sense for that type actually, because he's very introverted, very bookwormish, and he's just like, I just I had enough. I'm gonna nail this to the door, and it upset a lot of people. And if the Catholic Church would have got their hands on him, I'm sure they would have punished him a lot. But usually INTJs, that's how they differ from INFJs or ENFJs and ENTJs, is that they're much more insidious. They're much more sneaky. They usually don't get caught. But you go up to historical examples of people that are real life people. In their day and age, they would be considered villains and hostile. But in retrospect, in hindsight, we name streets after them. We honor them because they built the world we live in. Another one, Martin Luther King, for example. He was a revolutionary. He wanted to change things. But people, his contemporaries, were hostile to him. They were scared of the change he was bringing. I mean, even John F. Kennedy, he was kind of standoffish. You didn't really know if you could trust him at first. It wasn't until Martin Luther King demonstrated that he would believe in nonviolence. And even ignoring that, look at what happened to Martin Luther King. He was assassinated. It's because our society fears people who change things. Same thing with Malcolm X. He was assassinated. I mean, he was much more edgy than Martin Luther King, just for starters. But in the segue, going back to superheroes, those two characters are the models for Magneto and Charles Xavier of the X-Men. Magneto was Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King was Charles Xavier. Charles Xavier is like, we have to live together in peace. We have to find a way to make this work. While Malcolm X and Magneto were like, no, we want this at all cost now, and we're going to make it happen. And Magneto is considered an INTJ. He's very much a villain. He very much wants to change the status quo, and he frightens people. So I don't think it's so. It is to a degree that it's not just that they're INTJs. It's mainly because they want to change the status quo. But I think if it boils down to it, INTJs are the best at changing the status quo. Every single letter in that category helps them do this. Being introverted gives them time to focus on ideas and helps them be a little more insidious and sneaky under the radar. Of course, intuition helps you come up with the good ideas. T, logic, you need that to figure things out. It may not make you super motivated, but you figure things out. And of course, J has you get things done. Like an INTP, for example, I think they have better ideas, but they don't always have the discipline to actually come to fruition, make it happen. But of all the types that are world changers, INTJs are probably the most successful because of all those things that work together, and they kind of sneak under the radar. And that scares people. And because as a villain, you want them to be a little scary. Someone that comes at you straightforward and has a dumb idea is a boring villain because you can just deal with it. But if you don't see them coming and have a really idea that makes sense, yeah, you're going to be a little afraid. And that's the perfect kind of villain to have your boring vanilla status quo Superman go off against. And if you look at fiction, a very good example of heroes that don't maintain the status quo or modern depictions, stories full of anti-heroes. And I think that one of the best ones is probably the Watchmen. And in that, I think the best character that's a INTJ is Ozymandias. He is an INTJ through and through. Meanwhile, Dr. Manhattan, for example, is an INTP. And you can contrast and compare those two characters. Dr. Manhattan, he has these brilliant ideas, all this phenomenal power, but he never really does anything. He doesn't really change the world. He knows humanity's messed up. He can't understand it. And he decides to pull away and withdraw and focus internally on his ideas. Ozymandias, however, the whole story is about it. Hope spoilers. 10-year-old, 20-year-old movie, spoilers. Ozymandias is about coming up with a plan and changing the world. He's an INTJ. He doesn't maintain the status quo. He upsets it. And he succeeds. He comes up with a plan that he realizes, if you haven't seen the movie, it's a great movie, but it's United States and Russia are on the edge of nuclear war, which we were in the early 80s. Nuclear war could happen any minute, and billions of people could die like that. And Ozymandias had all those character traits. He was introverted. People didn't see it coming. He had intuition. He could figure things out. He was logical, and he was judgmental. He carried his plan through. And his plan was to blame Dr. Manhattan for it. So he gave everyone a common enemy. So instead of the Russians fighting the Americans and the Americans fighting the Russians, we fought Dr. Manhattan. We thought he was the bad guy. It's messed up. It's wrong. It's unethical. But ultimately, it worked. It saved lives. It's a frightening prospect. It's an INTJ plan that doesn't get stopped by Superman. It comes to fruition. It works. I remember speaking when the movie first came out, I asked people, what'd you think of it? And it's mainly to gauge what kind of people they were. And one time I asked a fireman. Now, I knew firemen tended to be more conservative, more traditional sensor types. And they're good people that care about everyone, but they care about the here and now, what's in front of them, and they want to save lives. I asked this fireman, what'd you think of it? And he's like, I hated it. There was no good guys, there was no bad guys. They were all just, even the best good guy, he had a good plan, but it was involved killing lots of people. It was just terrible. It was nothing like Superman. So in the movie Watchmen, there's no black, there's no white, everything's gray. And you notice that movie, there's no villains. There's just a bunch of gray heroes. Everybody has a little bit of good, everybody has a little bit of bad. And to me, that tells me a lot about our society. That all of our fiction, our stories tell a lot about us. If I want to channel my inner Admiral Thrawn, our art and culture tells a lot about us. And all of our fictional characters are conservative heroes. They maintain the status quo. They never want to change the world. And that's why INTJs are seen as so negative, because we're the best at changing the world. And add on top of that, take into consideration our human history. Now, we've been around for about 200,000 years since we were first evolved. Humans were humans. And when we first started living in cities, it was around 10,000 BC. That's when we started being civilized. We were before they were hunter-gatherers. So that was about 6% of our human history. Actually, my math's off. It's about 0.5%, about 0.06% of our human history is us living in cities. And what was life like before that, before we were civilized living in cities? Life was hard. Food was scarce. I mean, it was so scarce. I mean, if you wanted to reproduce and have children of your own, you had to eat enough calories a day to do it. You needed at least 2,000 calories just to survive. You need a surplus to have kids. That means you have to be very successful, which is really hard to do if you're a hunter-gatherer. Also, in just general life expectancy, I mean, the idea of you living to the age of 35 and in your 30s isn't very common. And if you want your genes to carry forward in the next generation, you really actually need your grandchildren to live to that age. So not only do you have to live, but your kid and their kid has to live that, to have your genes really carry over. And that's uncommon. And that was 99.5% of our human history. So a lot of how we look at the world, a lot of how we approach everything from picking our mating partners to how we view threats and dangers, 95 or 99.5% comes from our prehistoric, our caveman ancestors, our Ooga Booga. And when life is hard and life is difficult and you could die at any moment from a saber-toothed tiger or an unfriendly caveman coming around the corner with an axe aiming towards your head, you get pretty conservative. You don't take chances. You want to maintain the status quo. Keep things as simple as they are. Resources are scarce. Why do you gamble? Why do you take chances? And that all things started to change when you lived in the city. When you have the agricultural revolution changed that. You had a surplus of food. You had a surplus of food. Not everybody had to be a hunter. Not everybody had to be a farmer. You could have specialized. First you had the priests, and you'd have scholars and artisans, etc. that specialized in things that you weren't good at. So that freed a lot of people up, and you could start to change things. But even then, take for example, living in Roman times. Stay with me. This does deal with the INTJ and all that. I'm getting there. But even then, things didn't change much. If you're living in the Roman Empire or even Byzantium or Babylon or any of the Samaria, things didn't change much between generations. You could go a span of 5 to 10 generations and you could talk to an elder and it's like, what advice do you have for me? He would give you advice and it would work because his life was exactly like yours. And plus he's been there, he's done that. He's had enough time to think and reflect. So you could count on older generations. Nothing really changed. And sure, there'd be a technology advance or invaders would come in and the new boss would be the same as the old boss. Not much would change. You could get advice from the elders and your culture and society. Things didn't really start changing dramatically until the scientific revolution. And we're talking 1500s with Galileo and Copernicus and Francis Bacon, all of those. The scientific method. And Copernicus, for example, the first one to come up with the idea that Earth is not the center of the universe. Actually, it's more the sun. Heliocentric. Before that, the church believed that the Earth was the center. It would make sense. God made Earth. We are at the center. But Galileo looked at Jupiter and saw moons orbiting Jupiter, so therefore those moons aren't orbiting the Earth. Earth's not the center. And Copernicus not only sees the sun as the center, but my calculations can calculate the star movements. Irrefutable proof. My calculations are more correct because I'm using the formula of the sun being at the center. So the church had to deal with it. And of course, Copernicus was he was a radical. He was changing the way people thought, much like an INTJ. And they ostracized him, both him and Galileo. So I mean, it's a very much change in how things happened. But this change since the scientific revolution has only accelerated. It's accelerated since the Industrial Revolution. It's accelerated since the communication age, or our age, the age we're living in, computer age, whatever you want to call it. All that's changed, and it's changing very quickly. For example, in the age of wooden cells, we're talking late 1800s, probably 1840, there was a British admiral, I forgot his name, Jack something, but he started as an enlisted sailor aboard a wooden ship with sails and smoothbore cannons, and that's it. By the time he left, it was 1920. He went from wooden ships to iron ships, aircraft carriers, and submarines. That's how much it changed within his lifetime. And then the next generation, they'd go from the first airplanes like Kitty Hawk all the way up to Kitty Hawk. Yeah. First airplanes like that, they went from that. And within their lifetime, they would have the moon landings. That's a dramatic change. And if you have those two generations together, that's probably about 3 generations, grandfather, father, and son, you'd have 3 generations. You'd go from wooden sailing ships to men landing on the moon. How does society keep up with that? So you got that innate caveman, ooga booga, anything is new is change things, keep things simple and safe mentality that 99.5% of our human history has been being afraid of any change. And you got modern society with technology changing things every day, which is, technology is INTJ's thing. And this age is for INTJs. I mean, all other new technology is being ushered in with INTJs and their ways of thinking. take all the billionaires we have now, they're INTJs. Uh, Tesla, Elon Musk is INTJ. Zuckerberg, Facebook is probably an INTJ. I mean, I don't know for certain, but they sure do act like them. So you got this modern age that is making INTJs much more front stage and center, calling the shots. And you got that our human genetics, our caveman ooga booga saying, we don't take chances that could be a saber-toothed tiger, play it safe. Those things combined are making INTJs the perfect villains. And this is part of it's probably a kickback of how fast our society is changing is INTJs are ushering this in. So this is kind of a rebellion not only against that, but against what we represent. So other than that, and if you doubt how much effect Facebook and Elon Musk has had on society, well, they've had. I mean, in the last 10 years, look how much it's changed with internet, YouTube, Facebook. We've changed ourselves in just a short span, which is a simple application of technology, really think about it. And that's a radical change. And it doesn't matter who you are, if you like it or you don't like it, you have to live with it. And so a lot of this people are pushing back against, and the focus of it is the INTJ, and that's why they make such good villains. Because they represent stuff that we kind of resent, the ever-encroachment of technology changing the way we live, and we don't want things to change. And I think also life is just so hard. We're barely spinning plates, keeping things up and juggling, and you want me to start throwing me chainsaws to juggle, make it harder? You want to change what I barely got this down, you want to change it again? And that's what INTJs do, and they do it the best. So that's why they make the best villains. And if you notice, I think it's more recently in our fictional history. If you go back to ancient times, you don't see ancient villains being INTJs or acting like INTJs. You see them just being more generic, I think. So that's my 2 cents on the idea. Oh, I think I covered all my bases I want to. Hopefully I got everything across. If you guys like this video, I might make some more. Until next time, thanks. Wait, I'll do the INTJ stare. You guys like that? Okay. I should do like a fans only page where I just do an INTJ stare for like an hour and it costs $50. See ya.